Get off my property, I shouted, my voice cracking through the early morning calm. Blue and red lights splashed across my cedar fence like a crime scene. My heart pounded in my chest as the officer's hand hovered near his belt, not in threat, but in confusion. The only crime committed here was apparently the height of my fence. Just hours earlier, my morning had been peaceful. I'd made coffee, opened the kitchen window, and watched sunlight spill across the lawn. I'd only been in Lakewood, Colorado, for 3 months, hoping for quiet after a decade of nursing night shifts and losing my husband to cancer. The house, with its small yard and new fence, felt like my reset button. Until that morning, when the peace shattered with the sound of sirens and gravel crunching under police tires. When I stepped outside, still in my robe, I saw him. The man I'd later learned was Gerald Thompson, the HOA president. Late 50s, clean-shaven, with a smugness that clung to him like cheap cologne. He stood by the curb, arms crossed, a clipboard in hand like it was a badge of authority. The officer beside him looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight as if he already regretted answering the call. "Ma'am," the officer began, glancing at Gerald before speaking, "we got a report of a possible code violation concerning your fence." I blinked at him, the words sinking in like a bad joke. "You're kidding me, right? You're telling me someone called 911 over a fence?" The officer sighed. "Yes, ma'am. The caller said it exceeds the neighborhood's height restriction." Gerald stepped forward, cutting him off. "Rules are rules, officer. She's in violation of HOA policy section 7.4. 6 feet maximum. Her fence is clearly over that." His tone was clipped, rehearsed, the kind of voice that expects obedience. Neighbors had started gathering, some standing on porches, others peeking through blinds. The humiliation burned my cheeks. I'd worked hard for this house, saved for years, and now, here I was, being treated like a criminal because my fence looked too tall to a man with a measuring tape and too much free time. "I had this fence professionally installed," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "The city approved it." Gerald gave a dry chuckle. "The HOA has higher standards than the city, Mrs. Miller. We don't want ununiform elements ruining property values." The officer's brow furrowed. "Sir, calling 911 for a non-emergency like this isn't appropriate. This sounds like a civil matter." Gerald's tone sharpened. "Well, I didn't know who else to call when a resident refuses to follow the rules." I wanted to scream, but all I could do was stand there, barefoot, robe fluttering in the wind, while my new neighbors whispered. The officer shifted awkwardly, clearly wanting to end the scene. "Ma'am, I'll need to take a quick look, just to confirm what's going on. HOA order." That phrase, HOA order, made my stomach twist. It wasn't a law, but somehow it sounded worse, like a private government ruling over every inch of my property. I opened the gate silently, letting the officer in. He walked the line of my fence slowly, Gerald trailing behind with that damn clipboard, scribbling notes as if he were auditing my soul. The wind picked up, rattling the wood slats. The moment felt heavier than it should have. Too much authority for such a small space. When the officer finished his slow inspection, he turned to me with a look I couldn't read. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we'll have to measure it, by HOA order." And that's when I realized this wasn't about a fence at all. It was about control. "Mrs. Miller, this neighborhood doesn't do individuality," Gerald barked, his voice sharp enough to slice through the chatter in the HOA meeting. His clipboard trembled in his hand, not from fear but from the weight of his own authority. Every eye in the room turned toward me, and I suddenly understood. This wasn't a homeowners association. It was his kingdom. After the fence incident, I decided to attend my first HOA meeting. I wanted to understand how this man had enough power to summon police over 2 inches of wood. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, pastel walls, stale coffee smell, folding chairs arranged like a courtroom. Gerald sat at the head table, under a banner that read Maple Grove Homeowners Association. The way he positioned himself, You'd think it said welcome to Gerald's empire. He was in his late 50s, but there was something youthful about his arrogance. The kind that doesn't fade with age. Retired insurance adjuster, according to the whispers. The type who found meaning in paperwork and control. He wore pressed khakis, a tucked-in polo with the HOA logo stitched perfectly over his heart, and a smug grin that never reached his eyes. Every question from the room filtered through him. Every decision ended with his word. When one homeowner, a quiet man named Daniel, asked for permission to install solar panels, Gerald leaned forward and said, "We don't want our neighborhood looking like a science experiment, do we?" Everyone laughed nervously, and Daniel sank into silence. No one dared challenge him. I realized this wasn't leadership. It was intimidation masked as order. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and cleared my throat. "About my fence," Gerald interrupted immediately. "Your fence is a non-compliance issue, Mrs. Miller. It will be addressed formally." I frowned. Addressed how? I submitted the city's approval. He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "The HOA's rules are higher than the city's, ma'am. You'll learn that soon enough." A woman at the end of the table, Linda, the HOA secretary, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I noticed her fingers tapping nervously on her notebook, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. The entire board sat stiffly, like soldiers obeying a dictator. I left that meeting with a pit in my stomach. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. Gerald had a way of making everyone feel smaller, like they existed only to uphold his version of perfection. He reminded me of a man who'd lost real power somewhere in his life and rebuilt it here, one rule at a time. That night, as I drove home, I saw his white SUV parked half a block from my house. Headlights off, engine idling. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but when it happened again the next evening, and again the one after that, I knew it wasn't coincidence. It felt like surveillance. I closed my blinds more often. I double-checked the locks. Every time I stepped outside, I felt his invisible gaze. A part of me wanted to report him, but who would I even call? He was the system here. The neighbors avoided the topic, afraid to be next on his radar. One woman, while walking her dog, whispered as she passed my driveway, "Keep your head down. He's been doing this for years." I smiled politely, but inside I burned. I hadn't moved here to live under someone else's thumb. The next morning, when I stepped outside to fetch the mail, the sun caught something bright stuck to my front door. A yellow citation, crisp and bold, fluttered in the breeze. In block letters, it read, "Fence exceeds 6-foot limit. Immediate action required." "Fine," I snapped. "Let's measure it right now." My voice echoed across the cul-de-sac. Gerald stood at the edge of my driveway, smirking like a man who'd already won a case he hadn't argued yet. His clipboard dangled from his hand as if it were a badge of divine authority. It had been only 2 days since the yellow citation appeared on my door. I'd written a polite email to the HOA board asking for clarification and cited the city's approval for my fence. Instead of replying, Gerald did something that still makes my stomach twist. He called 911 again. By the time the patrol car rolled up, neighbors were already gathering. Curtains twitched, front doors cracked open, whispers traveled fast. I recognized the same officer from the first incident. He climbed out slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose before even approaching us. The look on his face said it all. "Not again." "Mr. Thompson," the officer said wearily, "you told dispatch there was a dispute escalating on this property?" Gerald gestured toward me dramatically, as though presenting a suspect. "Yes, officer. Mrs. Miller refuses to comply with HOA regulations. I'm simply asking that our community standards be enforced." I folded my arms. "He's harassing me. I have approval from the city. I followed every rule. He's wasting your time, again." The officer sighed. "All right, folks, let's not turn this into a circus. Why don't we just measure both fences and see what we're working with? That way, no one's word is against the other." Gerald's smirk faltered for just a second. "That's unnecessary. I've already filed the infraction notice. No, the officer interrupted, his patience thinning. If you want me here, we're doing it by the book. Both fences. Let's go. He retrieved a long metal tape from his patrol car and extended it toward me first. I stepped aside, my pulse steady but my palms damp. The air was cool, but it carried that heavy tension you can almost taste. The officer anchored one end of the tape to the ground and stretched it to the top of the fence. Exactly 6 feet, he said, glancing toward Gerald. Nothing over. I exhaled slowly, feeling a wave of vindication crawl up my spine. But Gerald wasn't ready to let go. That can't be right, he snapped. Your tape must be off. Check it again. The officer didn't even flinch. Happy to. But we'll check yours next. For a moment, everything went still. The neighbors who had gathered leaned in from their porches. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Gerald's jaw tightened. He led the way to his own backyard, muttering under his breath about ungrateful residents and incompetent measurements. When we reached his fence, the officer crouched, anchored the tape, and extended it upward. I watched the numbers climb. 5 feet, 5.5, 6, 6.5. 6 feet, 4 inches, the officer read out loud, his tone deliberately neutral. You could have heard a pin drop. Gerald's face turned the color of his SUV, white with embarrassment. Must be settling, he stammered. Wood expands. The officer straightened up and gave him a flat look. Sir, looks like you're violating your own HOA rule. A few neighbors gasped quietly. Someone chuckled. The tension that had strangled the air broke into something lighter, satisfying. Gerald's eyes darted between the officer and me, his smirk gone, replaced by pure fury. He opened his mouth, closed it, then stormed off toward his SUV without a word. I stood there in silence, my pulse still racing. The officer gave me a faint smile. Ma'am, I'd document everything from now on. I nodded, watching Gerald's car disappear down the street. For the first time since I'd moved in, I felt like maybe, just maybe, the truth had started to tilt in my favor. You embarrassed me, Gerald hissed through his car window that night. His voice was low, like a threat whispered through gritted teeth. The headlights from his white SUV cut across my driveway before he peeled away into the dark. I stood there, frozen, not realizing that those 4 words were a declaration of war. The next morning, my mailbox was gone. Not vandalized. Gone. The bolts were ripped clean out of the concrete. The post missing like it had been professionally removed. I called the post office, and they confirmed no service issue. Ma'am, the clerk said, this looks deliberate. I didn't need her to tell me by who. Within 48 hours, the fine started. The first one came tucked in a white HOA envelope marked Urgent Compliance Notice. Violation. Trash bins visible from street view. Fine. $50. The bins were behind the fence. I had photos. The next day, another notice. Violation. Unapproved paint tone on mailbox. Except, of course, my mailbox didn't exist anymore. By the end of the week, 3 more citations followed. Excess weeds. Fence reflection causing glare. Bird feeder attracting pests. I couldn't decide if it was insanity or obsession. Gerald wasn't enforcing order. He was punishing defiance. At first, I laughed it off. But laughter doesn't last when your peace is being chipped away, 1 letter at a time. Every new envelope felt heavier than the last. My kitchen counter turned into a stack of false accusations, each stamped with Gerald's neat, smug signature. I started documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, emails, even video footage from my doorbell camera. Every call to the HOA office, every visit from Gerald, every notice taped to my door went into a thick binder I labeled HOA harassment file. I was a nurse. I'd been trained to keep detailed records. This time, the patient was my sanity. Neighbors began to notice. One evening, while I was pulling weeds that didn't exist, a woman named Carol slowed her walk as she passed. She didn't look directly at me, just murmured, "He did this to the Robinsons too." They sold and left within 6 months. Then she kept walking. The way she said it, quiet, fearful, made my stomach sink. That night, I sat by my kitchen window and watched his SUV creep past for the third time. No headlights, just that silhouette of a man who got drunk on the power of paper and bylaws. I felt trapped in my own home, a prisoner behind a perfectly legal fence. I started researching my rights, desperate for something to fight back with. That's when I stumbled across the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, CCIOA. I learned that under Section 2195, HOAs were required to issue written notice with opportunity to cure before issuing any fine. None of Gerald's notices followed that process. He was violating state law, not enforcing it. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the end of the week. I decided I'd show up, binder in hand, not to argue, to expose. But the moment I began to plan my move, someone unexpected knocked on my door. It was Linda, the HOA secretary. She looked pale, nervous, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. She slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand and whispered, "You didn't get this from me." When I opened it, the note was short. Barely 3 lines, written in shaky pen. "He's hiding something about his own fence permits. Check county records." I looked up to ask what she meant, but Linda was already walking away fast, her eyes fixed on the ground. That was the moment I realized Gerald's control wasn't just about me. He'd built his little empire on lies, and I had just been handed the key to its cracks. "Ma'am, that drawer's restricted," the clerk warned, her voice hesitant but firm. I froze, my hand hovering just above the metal filing cabinet. But it was too late, I'd already seen it. The file tab read, "Thompson, Gerald, fence permit application." And across the top of the document, stamped in thick red ink, was one single word, "Rejected." It was a Tuesday morning when I decided to visit the county records office. The air inside smelled faintly of paper and toner, the kind of place that hums with quiet bureaucracy. Rows of beige cabinets lined the walls, each drawer a graveyard of old permits and inspection reports. I told the clerk I was there to confirm property documents for my home. That was true, just not the whole truth. After weeks of Gerald's harassment, Linda's warning note had burned a hole in my pocket. He's hiding something about his own fence permits. I needed proof, not rumors. I spent nearly an hour flipping through binders and indexes, pretending to study my own paperwork, until I found the section labeled Maple Grove HOA. The files smelled old, dust, ink, and stale air. Then I saw it. Gerald's name, address. Fence installation request, dated 3 years ago. My pulse kicked into overdrive. I slipped the file halfway out and scanned the top sheet. The denial reason was brutally clear. Fence exceeds approved height and violates setback requirements. Applicant failed to submit updated blueprints. So the man who'd called the police on me twice, who'd fined me for non-compliance, had built his own fence illegally. I felt a mix of vindication and fury surge through me. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos. One of the rejection stamp, one of the letter from the zoning department, and another of his signature acknowledging the denial. I knew it was risky, but this was the kind of truth people like Gerald buried under intimidation and fear. I wasn't going to let him rewrite the rules anymore. The clerk must have sensed my intensity because she cleared her throat nervously. "Ma'am, we don't usually allow photography in this section." I slipped the phone back into my bag and offered a polite smile. "Oh, of course. I was just reviewing something." Her expression softened. "You know, county records are public property. Homeowners have a right to review any approved or denied permits for properties within their community. You can even request certified copies if you need them." That was my legal confirmation, the nugget I needed. Under open access laws, what I found wasn't theft. It was public information, and I planned to use every bit of it. I gathered my things and walked toward the exit, my pulse still pounding, my mind racing with the possibilities. This could end Gerald's reign, if I handled it right. The truth was finally tangible, sitting in the palm of my hand, waiting to be exposed. But just as I pushed open the heavy glass door, a familiar voice stopped me cold. "Well, well," Gerald said, his tone slick as oil. He was leaning against the building's stone wall, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. "I had a feeling you'd come snooping around here." My stomach dropped. I hadn't told a soul about this trip. Not even Linda. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're making a very big mistake, Sarah." There was no smirk this time, just a cold certainty in his tone. The kind of warning that didn't come from anger, but from fear of being caught. I met his stare without flinching. "No, Gerald," I said quietly. "I'm fixing yours." His jaw tightened, but I didn't wait for his reply. I walked past him, clutching my bag tight, every instinct screaming that this fight had just turned dangerous. "Order!" Gerald roared, slamming his gavel so hard it cracked against the wood table. The sound echoed through the small clubhouse like a gunshot, but this time, I didn't flinch. I sat upright, my binder resting on my lap like a shield, my evidence ready to detonate. The room was packed tighter than usual. Word had spread through Maple Grove that tonight's HOA meeting was going to be eventful. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the whisper of rebellion in the air, but every seat was filled. Neighbors who once avoided my gaze now sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see what would unfold. Gerald, at the head of the table, wore his usual uniform, khaki pants, HOA polo, and that air of superiority that reeked of someone who'd never been challenged. He started the meeting like a man desperate to hold on to control. "First order of business," he announced, "is compliance violations. We have ongoing issues with several residents, including Mrs. Miller." He said my name like it was dirt on his tongue. I rose slowly, ignoring the heat in my cheeks. "Actually, Gerald," I said, voice steady, "I'd like to address that, since it seems I'm the topic of nearly every meeting." He frowned, tapping his pen. "This is not an open forum. It's about the HOA's integrity." I cut in. "And since we're talking about compliance, I brought something the entire community deserves to see." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. I placed my binder on the table, flipping it open to the photographs I'd taken at the county office. The bright red stamp glared under the fluorescent lights. "Rejected. This," I said clearly, "is your fence permit, Gerald. Denied 3 years ago for exceeding height and setback requirements. You fined me for a fence that's legal, while yours breaks the very rule you used against me." Gasps filled the room. People craned their necks, whispering to one another. A few faces I recognized. Daniel Carroll looked stunned. Gerald's face went pale, then red. "You had no right to access those records," he barked. "That's confidential HOA information." I didn't back down. "No, it's not. Colorado Revised Statute, Plural Color 38, 33.3, 209.5, ensures transparency. HOA records are public. Homeowners have the right to access them. You're not above the law." The room fell silent. Even Linda, the usually timid secretary, lowered her pen and met my eyes with a faint, approving nod. Gerald leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can come into my community and make accusations? You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Your community?" I said, letting the words hang. "Or ours?" Someone from the back muttered, "She's right." Another added, "Yeah, we've all had enough." The tide was turning right before his eyes. His composure cracked. "You don't know what you've started," he yelled, pointing at me. His gavel slammed again, echoing off the walls like the last act of a desperate man. I stood my ground. Maybe I've started something that should have happened years ago. The murmurs rose into voices, angry, emboldened, alive. Neighbors who once hid behind blinds were now standing, demanding answers. Gerald shoved back his chair. "This meeting is over," he shouted, snatching his clipboard and storming toward the exit. His voice echoed one final time through the room. "You'll regret this, Sarah. You hear me?" The door slammed, rattling the windows. The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore, it was relief. For the first time since I'd moved to Maple Grove, I didn't feel like the outsider. I felt like the spark that had finally lit the fire. The envelope was thick and cruel, went to $2,100 fine, and a line that made my stomach drop. Lien proceedings pending. I stared at it for a full minute before I even tore it open. I'd thought, after humiliating him at the meeting, that Gerald would finally back off. I was wrong. He wasn't finished. He was furious. The letterhead was official-looking, stamped with the HOA's logo, and signed once again by President Gerald Thompson. The tone was cold and mechanical, each word sharpened to inflict panic. It accused me of continued non-compliance, of disrupting HOA operations, of causing reputational harm to the community. Reputational harm. That's what standing up to him was now called. I dropped the paper on the kitchen counter and pressed my palms against the cool marble, trying to steady my breathing. The house felt smaller, quieter, as if it too had been silenced by his reach. Every corner of my home, the place I'd built to heal, suddenly felt owned by someone else. I sat on the floor and cried. Not the kind of crying that brings relief, but the kind that empties you. I'd fought back with truth, with proof, with the law, and still he found a way to twist it. I began to wonder if this was how everyone else before me had been broken down. One thread at a time until they just gave up and left. By sunset, I'd made myself a cup of tea I couldn't drink and watched his white SUV roll past my driveway again. The audacity of it made me want to scream. But instead, I reached for the phone. I needed to talk to someone. Anyone. That's when Tom showed up. He was my next-door neighbor, a quiet, middle-aged man who'd mostly kept to himself since his wife passed. He had a background in property management, something I'd only learned during small talk months earlier. He must have seen the letter on my doorstep because he knocked softly and asked, "You okay, Sarah?" I handed him the notice without saying a word. He read it carefully, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. When he finished, he shook his head. "He can't do this. This isn't how it works." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Under Colorado HOA law," he explained, "they can't just slap a lien on your property. It requires due process, board approval, and proof of unpaid valid fines. You've got him cornered, and now he's bluffing." The words, "he's bluffing," felt like oxygen. I hadn't realized how tightly fear had wrapped itself around my chest until that moment. Tom sat down across from me and pulled out his laptop. "We'll draft a response together. You'll cite the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, Section 316. They need a formal vote to pursue liens. No board approval, no legal grounds." For the first time in days, I smiled. Faintly, but genuinely. Someone was on my side. We spent the next 2 hours crafting an email, attaching scanned copies of the false citations, and quoting the statute word for word. Tom helped me submit it to both the HOA and the state regulatory agency. Before he left, he put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Bullies like him thrive on silence. You've already hit him where it hurts. Don't stop now." After he left, the house felt different. Not bigger, but lighter. I made myself a promise. If Gerald wanted a war, I'd make sure it was one fought with the truth. But just as I started to feel hope again, a knock echoed through the hallway. A courier stood at my door holding a certified letter. "Mrs. Miller?" he asked. "Signature required." I scribbled my name, tore open the envelope, and froze. Notice of property foreclosure proceedings. My knees nearly gave out. "This time, sir, you're the one under investigation." The same officer who'd once been called to measure my fence now stood in Gerald's driveway, his badge catching the afternoon sun. For the first time since I'd met him, Gerald didn't have that smug, untouchable grin. He stood stiffly beside his pristine SUV, his clipboard nowhere in sight. I watched from my window, heart hammering in my chest. After weeks of fear, letters, and sleepless nights, justice had finally come to my street. The morning after receiving the foreclosure notice, I'd broken down completely. I remember pacing my kitchen, clutching the letter so tightly it crumpled in my hands. I knew it wasn't legal. Tom had told me as much. But fear doesn't listen to reason. Fear whispers worst-case scenarios until you start believing them. That's when I decided to take the next step. to take the fight beyond Maple Grove. I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies, DORA. The process was meticulous. Forms, attachments, sworn statements. I included copies of every citation, every fine, every photo, and even the officer's incident report from the day Gerald called 911 about my fence. I didn't just want Dora to know what happened to me. I wanted them to see what Gerald had done to our entire neighborhood. 2 weeks passed before I received an acknowledgement letter. The state had opened an official investigation into the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, citing potential violations of the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. The words looked beautiful on the page. Gerald had finally attracted the attention of someone who could actually stop him. A week later, the officer, the same one who'd been humiliated into playing referee with a tape measure, came by my house in plain clothes. He introduced himself properly this time. Officer Reed. He looked tired but genuinely sympathetic. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "Dora contacted our department. They're reviewing your HOA's actions and they requested my testimony about those 911 calls." My eyes widened. "You mean, you're testifying?" He nodded. "Those calls were never emergencies. Your neighbor used the police, like his personal enforcement arm. That's not just unethical. It's misuse of emergency services. My report's already been submitted." It was the first time I'd heard someone in authority say aloud what I already knew. Gerald's power wasn't real. It was paper-thin and built on intimidation. The next few days felt strangely calm. No letters, no cars idling outside. For the first time in months, I was able to drink my coffee in peace. I began hearing whispers from other neighbors too, how Dora investigators had started calling residents, asking questions about fines, HOA finances, and Gerald's behavior. It wasn't just me anymore. The neighborhood was finally speaking up. On a quiet Thursday morning, a black sedan with government plates rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac. I was trimming the roses by the fence when it stopped in front of Gerald's house. 2 investigators stepped out, both carrying slim briefcases and wearing the calm expressions of people who already knew the truth. Gerald must have seen them from his office window because he burst out onto his porch before they even reached the walkway. "What's this about?" he demanded, his voice trembling just slightly. One of the investigators flashed her badge. "Mr. Thompson, we're here on behalf of the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. You've been subpoenaed to provide all HOA financial and compliance records for the last 3 years." I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. His tone grew sharper by the second. "You can't just show up here without notice. I'm the president of this community." The male investigator's reply was cool, almost bored. "Not anymore, sir. You've been temporarily suspended pending inquiry." Across the street, blinds fluttered. Neighbors were watching, just like they'd watched when the police came for me. But this time, the shame didn't belong to me. Gerald's voice cracked. "This is harassment. I've done nothing wrong." Officer Reed, who'd arrived minutes earlier to assist, took a deliberate step forward. His tone carried quiet satisfaction. "Funny, that's exactly what she said the first time you called us about her fence." I almost laughed, but instead I just stood still, watching as Gerald's posture deflated. He tried to argue, but every excuse sounded weaker than the last. His clipboard, his symbol of power, lay forgotten on his porch. By the time the investigators loaded their documents into the car, Gerald's color had drained. He wasn't yelling anymore. He was just staring down the street, maybe realizing that his empire had finally turned to dust. For the first time since moving here, I didn't feel afraid of him. I felt free. As the investigator's sedan pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of Gerald's reflection in his window. That arrogant smile he always wore, the one that used to make my stomach turn, was gone. But what I didn't know then was that desperate men rarely surrender quietly, and Gerald Thompson was about to prove it. "You're not the only one," my neighbor whispered. Her eyes darted nervously toward Gerald's house before she stepped closer. "We've all got stories, and they all end the same way. With him." Her words lit a fuse I didn't even know was still there. For months I'd carried this fight alone, convinced I was the only one brave or foolish enough to stand up to Gerald Thompson. But I was wrong. I wasn't alone. After the investigators showed up and the news spread that Dora had subpoenaed the HOA, it was like a spell broke over Maple Grove. The fear that had kept everyone quiet started to crack. It began with small conversations, hushed voices over fences, neighbors pausing their morning walks to glance at my house, then finally stepping closer to talk. Carol, the woman who'd once whispered warnings to me, was the first to open up. She told me about the $800 fine she'd received 2 years ago for storing a canoe improperly. The canoe had been behind her fence. He made me pay it before I could appeal, she said. Said it would look bad if I fought it. Then there was Daniel, the same man Gerald humiliated at that first meeting. He showed me a stack of letters threatening legal action for unauthorized solar equipment. His panels had city approval, just like my fence. He'd finally given up and removed them. Each story followed the same pattern: intimidation, humiliation, silence. It was as if Gerald had been running his own little dictatorship, using fear as his currency. But now that fear was crumbling. Within a week, small gatherings started forming in driveways and garages. What began as whispers turned into planning. Someone suggested creating a neighborhood group chat, independent of the HOA. Another neighbor offered to help collect everyone's stories and documents to forward to the investigators. I watched the transformation happen in real time. People who used to avoid eye contact were now standing taller, speaking louder. Even the HOA board members, the ones who'd once nodded along with every word Gerald said, began to panic. Linda, the secretary who had slipped me that note weeks earlier, confirmed what we'd suspected. Dora's investigation wasn't just about Gerald's harassment. It included missing funds, misfiled permits, and years of financial irregularities. At the next emergency HOA meeting, Gerald didn't show up. He was under review, the vice president said nervously. The board voted unanimously to suspend him temporarily pending the outcome of the investigation. The room erupted in murmurs. Not fearful ones this time, but relief. You could feel the air shifting, like a long storm finally breaking. I sat quietly in the back, not needing to speak. My fight had sparked something bigger than I'd ever planned. By the time the meeting ended, several homeowners approached me to thank me. Some even apologized for staying silent before. You were brave when we weren't, Daniel said, shaking my hand. You gave us our voice back. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure I deserved their praise. I hadn't started this to be a hero. I just wanted my life back. But as I looked around the room at all the faces once dimmed by fear, now lit with something close to hope, I realized I'd become something I hadn't meant to be: a leader. The following nights were calm. For the first time in months, no citations appeared on doors. No mysterious cars idled down our street. Even the air felt cleaner. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes after surviving a storm. But peace, I was learning, never lasts long when pride is wounded. It was just after midnight when I woke to the faint hum of an engine outside. I slipped quietly to my window and pulled back the curtain. Down the street, the HOA office lights flickered on. Through the glass, I saw him, Gerald Thompson. He moved like a shadow, carrying a large box under one arm. He glanced around before slipping inside, locking the door behind him. My heart pounded. He wasn't supposed to have access. His suspension was official. Whatever he was doing in there, it wasn't authorized. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. If he was desperate enough to sneak in after midnight, then this wasn't over. Not even close. "Step away from the shredder, Mr. Thompson," the officer yelled. Paper confetti filled the air like snow, swirling through the fluorescent light of the HOA office. The grinding sound of the machine screeched to a stop, and in that frozen silence, I realized I was witnessing the moment Gerald Thompson's empire finally burned to the ground. It had all started an hour earlier when I'd spotted him slipping into the HOA office after midnight. I knew it wasn't paranoia this time. I'd seen the fear in his face when investigators came knocking. So I called Officer Reed directly. My voice had been calm, but my hands were shaking. "He's in the HOA office right now," I'd said, "and I think he's destroying evidence." When the police arrived, they didn't waste time. The lock was broken with one hard hit, and the smell of hot paper and toner wafted into the night air. I stood outside, heart racing, as flashlight beams cut through the darkness inside. When they burst into the main office, Gerald was there. Sleeves rolled up, sweat dripping down his temple, his hand halfway into a bin of shredded paper. The machine beside him was still humming, spitting out strips of what used to be documents. He didn't even look surprised. Just tired. Officer Reed's voice was sharp and final. "Hands where I can see them. Step away from the shredder." Gerald straightened, his face pale under the flickering lights. "You have no right to be here," he snapped, his voice hoarse. "This is private property." "This is an active investigation," Reed replied. "And you're tampering with public records." Two more officers stepped forward, pulling open drawers and filing cabinets. Inside were half-empty folders, financial statements torn in half, and dozens of violation letters, all identical in format, all with fake signatures from board members who didn't exist. The lead investigator from Dora arrived minutes later, her expression unreadable as she scanned the mess. She picked up a strip of paper from the floor, piecing it together between her fingers. "These aren't just homeowner fines," she said. "These are expense authorizations. HOA funds, transferred into a private account." Gerald's mask slipped. "Those were reimbursements," he said quickly. I was owed." "Enough," she cut him off. "You're done." I stood near the doorway, clutching my phone, watching as everything that had haunted me for months unraveled in front of my eyes. It wasn't just about a fence or a fine anymore. It was about years of lies, money taken from good people, reputations destroyed for his ego. When the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, it was almost anticlimactic. Gerald didn't struggle or protest. He just stared down at the floor, his jaw tight, as if the weight of his own arrogance had finally caught up with him. Officer Reed read him his rights while another officer photographed the evidence. The shredded documents, the forged signatures, the laptop still open to an email draft labeled Board Directive, Enforcement Priority List. My name sat at the top. I didn't cry, and I didn't smile. I just breathed, a long, shaky exhale that felt like years of tension leaving my body all at once. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights painted the office windows again, just like they had that first day. But this time, they weren't for me. As the officers led Gerald out in cuffs, a few neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk, drawn by the noise and commotion. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Is that him?" Then the low hum of engines filled the air. News vans pulling up one by one, cameras already rolling, reporters scrambling for a shot of the disgraced HOA president being walked to the patrol car. The microphones started flashing, the cameras zoomed in, and for once, Gerald didn't look like the man who owned the block. He looked like a man who'd finally lost it all. "Your fines are dismissed, Miss Miller," the judge said, adjusting his glasses as his voice echoed through the courtroom. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal, like a bell ringing at the end of a very long war. For the first time in months, I felt free. It had taken weeks for the case to make its way through the local court system. After Gerald's arrest, the district attorney's office formally charged him with tampering with public records, falsification of HOA documents, and misuse of community funds. The community had been in uproar, neighbors giving statements, the local paper printing front-page updates about the HOA president gone rogue. Every headline felt like another layer of weight lifting off our shoulders. Still, even with him gone, I had to face the fallout. The bogus fines, the false liens, the foreclosure notice. They all had to be formally dismissed through the legal process. It was exhausting. Each hearing felt like reliving every humiliation, every sleepless night, every whispered threat. But I showed up for all of it. When the day of the final hearing came, I sat at the front with my lawyer, a quiet, sharp woman named Rebecca Torres, who specialized in HOA abuse cases. Across the aisle sat Gerald, dressed in a wrinkled gray suit, wrists unshackled but flanked by two deputies. His face was drawn, his once perfect posture slumped. The clipboard, the khaki uniform of authority, the smug confidence, they were all gone. Rebecca laid out the evidence clearly and calmly. She presented the Dora investigation report, the police findings, the fraudulent citations, and the falsified fines. She even played Officer Reed's body cam footage from the night of the shredder raid. The courtroom fell silent as Gerald's own voice filled the room. "You have no right to be here. This is private property," followed by the sound of shredded paper grinding to a stop. By the time she finished, Gerald wouldn't even meet my eyes. When the judge ruled in my favor, dismissing every fine, ordering restitution for legal costs, and permanently barring Gerald Thompson from any future HOA or property management role, a quiet murmur rippled through the room. Relief, disbelief, maybe even pride. It all mixed together in a kind of stunned applause of emotion. The judge looked directly at me. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his tone softer now. "It takes courage to stand up to abuse of power. I hope your community learns from this." "I think we already have," I managed to say. Outside the courthouse, the air was bright and cold. The press was waiting, of course. A reporter from the local channel thrust a microphone toward me. "Ms. Miller, how does it feel knowing the man who harassed you and your neighbors is finally being held accountable?" I hesitated. The easy answer would have been to say it felt amazing, victorious. But what I really felt was something deeper, something quieter. "It feels right," I said. "No one should live in fear in their own home. The law isn't just for people with power. It's for everyone." That clip would later air on the evening news, though I never watched it. I didn't need to. I knew what it meant. In the weeks that followed, Maple Grove changed. Meetings became open and transparent. Residents were given access to all financial records. New board members stepped forward. People who wanted to restore trust rather than enforce control. The tone of every conversation shifted. There was laughter again at gatherings, small talk over fences, kids riding bikes down the street without their parents glancing nervously toward Gerald's old house. One evening, Linda stopped by with a basket of muffins and tears in her eyes. "You don't know what you did for this place," she said. "You gave us back our neighborhood." I smiled, humbled. All I did was refuse to stay quiet. Still, there were moments when I caught myself glancing at Gerald's empty house, blinds drawn, lawn overgrown. Part of me wondered if he sat inside replaying every choice that led to his downfall. But another part didn't care. I'd spent too much time living in his shadow. Now, it was time to live in the light. A few days later, I received a thick envelope from the HOA's new interim president. I expected paperwork about the settlement or updated bylaws. Instead, when I opened it, a single sheet of paper slid out. It read, "Notice of election, Maple Grove HOA board nominations." Below that, in clean print, was a list of names. Mine was third from the top, Sarah Miller, nominated for president. I stared at it, speechless. Me, after everything? The irony was almost poetic. Tom knocked on the door just then, holding 2 coffees. "Saw the notice?" he asked, grinning. I laughed softly. "Yeah, can you believe it?" He handed me a cup. "You fixed the system once, Sarah. Maybe now you can lead it." I looked out toward my fence, the same one that started this whole mess, standing tall and unbothered in the fading sunset. For the first time, I didn't see a battle line. I saw a boundary I'd earned, and maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. As I turned back toward the table, the election notice still in my hand, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. A voicemail alert popped up. The transcript preview read only 2 words. "It's not over." "President Miller has a nice ring to it," Tom said, smiling as he leaned against the porch railing. The morning sunlight spilled over my cedar fence, catching every golden hue in the wood. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't looking at it with anxiety or anger. I was looking at it with pride. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a symbol of everything I'd fought for. Maple Grove had changed. The tension that once hung in the air had lifted, replaced with laughter, neighborly chatter, and the kind of peace you don't realize you've missed until it's back. The HOA meetings no longer felt like interrogations. They were open discussions now. Transparent. Fair. Linda had taken over as secretary again, this time with confidence instead of fear, and Tom had been voted onto the board as treasurer. And me? I'd been elected president. When the votes were counted, I almost didn't believe it. The same neighbors who once avoided my eyes now trusted me to lead. I didn't take that lightly. I wasn't interested in control or punishment. I just wanted to make sure no one ever felt the way I did, bullied in their own home, silenced by a system that was supposed to protect them. At my first official meeting as HOA president, I set one rule above all: transparency first, always. No closed-door decisions, no surprise fines, no intimidation. We rewrote the bylaws together, line by line, removing the vague language Gerald had used to manipulate people. It was tedious, yes, but it was healing. Afterward, as neighbors gathered around the refreshment table, Carol handed me a small potted plant. "For your porch," she said. "A reminder that something good can grow from something broken." I smiled, blinking back tears. "Thank you, Carol. I'll make sure it gets plenty of sunlight." Later that afternoon, I walked the length of my fence, fingertips brushing over the smooth boards. Every nail, every grain, every knot in the wood told a story of defiance, fear, courage, and finally justice. I thought about everything this journey had taught me. That courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through tears and still says, "Try again tomorrow." That justice doesn't come easy, but it comes to those who refuse to surrender. And that boundaries, literal and emotional, are worth fighting for. Tom joined me on the lawn, coffee in hand. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd see the day this neighborhood actually felt normal." "Normal's good," I replied, smiling. "Peaceful's even better." He nodded toward the fence. "Still 6 feet." I laughed softly. "Exactly 6. Not an inch higher." We stood there for a while, the quiet kind of comfortable that only comes after chaos. Birds chirped somewhere down the street. A lawnmower buzzed faintly in the distance. Maple Grove was alive again. Before heading inside, I turned back one last time to look at that fence in the sunlight. It stood tall, unshaken, proof that doing what's right can sometimes mean standing alone until others find the courage to stand beside you. That's when the doorbell rang. I frowned, setting down my mug and heading toward the door. On the porch stood a young woman holding a manila envelope and looking frazzled. She was new, probably just moved into the empty house on the corner. Her eyes darted nervously between me and the paper in her hands. "Hi," she said hesitantly. "You're Sarah Miller, right?" I nodded slowly. "That's me." She exhaled, relief washing over her face. "I was told you might understand. I just got this." She held up the envelope. Inside, I caught a glimpse of a familiar letterhead. "Notice of violation, Crestwood Homeowners Association." My heart sank, but my resolve didn't waver. "Come in," I said, pushing the door open. "Let's talk. Never let fear build higher walls than your fence, because standing up for what's right doesn't end when the fight is over. It begins when you decide no one else should face it alone."